Hello, good afternoon, Reese and Andy. It's a pleasure to have a three-way Skype chat going today. Now, today we are gathered to talk about aviation archaeology and some of the issues surrounding it, and some of the most pertinent issues, also some of the most poignant and emotive, and that is to what extent is, say, a crash site from the Second World War, a site which should be seen as a place, or rather a place where objects have been deposited and are ripe for the plucking, whether that's for personal collections or even to go back to a museum. To what extent is this true? Because from an archaeological understanding, a crash site is in context, and it's the landscape together with the remains that are there which actually make the site what it is. This balance, I suppose, between wanting to reclaim maybe the dead, or perhaps reclaim an aircraft for a museum, and also the archaeological integrity of the site. This balance is a really difficult one to get right, I suspect. Now, obviously, Andy, you've dealt with this quite a lot in the past, and what sort of thoughts do you have?
I've got many, Mark, and I hope we'll explore them over the next sort of 20 minutes, half an hour or so. And thank you for setting up the chance for us to discuss it like this. It's great to be talking to Newcastle and Geelong in Australia. It's quite a remarkable experience, actually. I think that we're in a very interesting situation vis-a-vis the archaeology of aviation at the moment, in that we don't actually have an archaeology of aviation. What we have is a series of excavations, research programs, and so on, which happen to be about aviation-related subjects. Sometimes it's individual aircraft, sometimes it's sites like airfields, factories, other things that are associated with. And what we don't have at the moment, certainly in the UK, and I think it's probably fair to say internationally, is any concept that there is an archaeology of aviation. Certainly any acceptance among the broader archaeological and academic archaeological community that there is an archaeology of aviation. I think we're just on the cusp of that, and I think that's one of the reasons it's such an exciting field to be a part of, and so it's so relevant that we're talking about it now. I think, to reduce it to one line, I think we're at the stage with the archaeology of aviation that we were at in the 1960s with maritime archaeology and industrial archaeology. I think there's a rapidly developing new subdiscipline that is going to become recognised, if not in the immediate future, certainly in the near future.
Right. Okay. Would you go along with that, Reese?
Absolutely. I mean, my understanding of the situation is that aviation sites are becoming looked at more predominantly from different sectors of society. For example, particularly when we're talking about the military, in Australia we do have archaeologists working with military units going out for the specific purpose of recovering sites like this and recording sites like this. Usually it's under the premise of returning the deceased pilots or aircrew. However, if you're talking about it from a purely archaeological perspective and not just returning deceased aircrews, I think that's also an interesting concept within itself, because you're talking about archaeological research there rather than a repatriation program run by the military.
Okay, now this is where it all starts to get a little bit difficult, because there are areas where collectors, for example, come in. There are areas where aviation enthusiasts come in, and many of whom actually will take great care of whatever material remains come into their charge. If they're tasked to look after something, or even if they just happen to come across something, they will keep it well. They won't let it go rusty, for example, in a shed, or they'll keep it fairly stable. But is that good enough? I mean, for example, it almost feels a little bit like the situation that we had just over 100 years ago, I suppose, in Egypt, where remains that were undeniably of great interest were being brought to Europe for the betterment of those remains, in order to keep them in a museum. And the argument, in a very colonialist way, was made that this is the best way to look after them. Local people can't possibly look after those remains. And it feels a little bit like that with aviation archaeology. I'm not saying that local people can't look after them, but rather that somehow they're better off at home. Now, in the past, actually, Andy, you've mentioned an example I think it was in Sweden, where there was a crash site which was subject to this removal of remains, but then remains were redeposited. Can you just talk about that for a bit?
Absolutely. It's a site in northern Sweden, up near the Arctic Circle, near a small town called Pohjois. The aircraft concerned is a Royal Air Force Lancaster called Easy, which is the crew called Easy Elsie. So Easy Elsie was bombing the Tirpitz in October 1944 when she was damaged, and the crew diverted to northern Sweden and crash landed on a bog. They all walked away. They were picked up and fairly quickly repatriated by the Swedish authorities, and the aircraft stayed on the bog. It was partially dismantled by the Swedish Air Force for intelligence reasons, because that's what the military do, and then after the war it went into possession, we understand, of a local scrap dealer who began to cut it up but never finished the job. So basically you have a Royal Air Force 617 Squadron Lancaster sitting on a bog in northern Sweden. In the 1970s and 80s, as the interest in aviation archaeology, or the interest in World War II wreck recovery, I won't call it archaeology, World War II wreck recovery, grew. There were moves, and there still are moves, to have the aircraft repatriated to Britain. At one stage as well in Sweden, part of the aircraft was removed to a museum, but it was then put back. At the same time, one of the aircraft's tail fins was given to the museum in Tromsø in Norway, where the sinking of the Tirpitz is commemorated. So pieces of the aircraft have gone into a museum context, but other pieces that were removed have been put back because it was decided it was inappropriate. It couldn't be properly displayed, conserved, and so on. So you're dealing with a complex history in the first place, and now actually as we speak there are further moves among the British, it has to be said, aviation enthusiasts, to have the aircraft removed from Pohjois and brought back to England for museum display. Now I have to say, personally, having visited the site very recently in the course of a TV programme, and I'm in the process of writing up the report about that, the aircraft is well displayed with special walkways built around it, so you don't actually have to walk on the bog and damage the environment or damage the aircraft by walking on it. It's well displayed. It's displayed with a view to the local environment. Nearby there's a picnic area and barbecue and even a self-composting loo. So you have this object that it has these strong resonances for the British. It's 617 Squadron, the Dam Busters, it's a Lancaster. But at the same time, it's been adopted by the local community. There's been a huge amount of work done, valuable work done by the Pohjois Archive Committee, the local historical society, who have researched the subject. It's been visited by the aircrew, surviving members of the aircrew and their families while they were still alive. And personally, I think it's a very interesting example of how what might be seen as a nationalistic cultural object can actually become adopted and become part of the cultural and heritage and natural environment of another community, and takes on a whole different value of meanings, layer of meanings and resonances and importances because of that. I think it's a complicated story. It's a complex story, but I think it's one that gives us lots of pointers when we're discussing this issue. And
I suppose in that sense, there's quite a good analogy going back from Scandinavia to here, in so much as the ongoing discussion surrounding many, for example, Viking silver hoards, which are found in places like Yorkshire and the east of England for the most part. There are those in, for example, Denmark who want those things back, even though much of the silver won't be from Denmark. They just sort of go, well, it's Viking, it must be ours. I just find that it's fascinating how this isn't just an issue which surrounds, I suppose, aviation and aircraft remains, but it seems to be particularly strong and particularly strong emotions which do surround them. I mean, what do you think, Rhys? Is there ever a good argument to be made for actually taking, say, a downed aircraft out of the landscape where it finds itself?
I would say yes. To be honest with you, there's going to be two sides to this story within the archaeological community. There will be people that say an aviation site like this should be left in situ if it's not in any immediate danger. And obviously, if it's in immediate danger, there's mitigating circumstances to resolve that issue. But I also think that what we have to look at, we have to look at a values-based approach here. We have to look at things like, does the area, for example, where this Lancaster is crash landed, is there an association with the local, there seems to be an association with the local community that they've valued it as part of themselves. So giving it that value, I believe, makes it part of their landscape just as much as it is part of this British national movement to get the planes back. I mean, it's just as important to these people in some ways. Do I think the situation could be resolved by moving the plane back to the United Kingdom? I don't think so. Not in this specific situation. I think it probably should be left where it is, predominantly because the Swedish have obviously, I mean, if they've set up things such as toilets and basically it's a visiting centre. If you've set that up, it's obviously being looked after appropriately. And yeah, I just think that to remove it and put it in a British museum, or in this case, even do it back up. I mean, that's what we're talking about, isn't it, Andy? Is if we bring this home, it will be done up again and then put on display in a museum.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the aircraft's in such a state that any attempt to restore it, you'd end up with basically a facsimile. And what's the point?
Well, and I suppose actually that's something which really interests me in this whole issue, is that there are those who reckon that actually, as long as you have a piece of an original plane in one of these facsimiles, it's been worth the effort. And yet, there is a very reasonable additional concern. I mean, cultural and local, whether or not a local group of people have sort of adopted the site to one side, and that is that these sites also represent crash sites. They're almost like crime scenes in that sense. And if you start plucking the bits that you like out of that area before it's been adequately investigated, are you in fact doing? I mean, I don't know. Could it border on a criminal act? I mean, I'm aware that there are situations, for example, in the Second World War, where if you monkey with a Second World War site, you're actually committing a crime. So, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's absolutely essential that anybody who goes into this area, particularly as regards to military aircraft, is fully aware of the fact that under international law, unless it's been specifically signed off by the government concerned, what's called the flag state, aircraft are covered by what's called sovereign immunity.
Well, just to clarify, so the flag state is the state from which the aircraft came, not where it landed.
Precisely. So, if you take an example of a British aircraft that came down in Germany during World War II, for example, the aircraft and the aircrew remain the property and the responsibility, respectively, of the British government. At the same time, local heritage law in Germany, whichever German lander it happens to be, would also apply. So you've got a double legal situation there when you're dealing with the military, and also there are statutes in international law under the Geneva Conventions and so on about the treatment of the remains of deceased military personnel and so on. So there's a lot of legal, quite correct legal scaffolding that has to be put in place before you even think about touching one of these sites. Certainly under UK practice, the Ministry of Defence will not grant you a licence under the British Protection of Military Remains Act to excavate or recover a British aircraft if there are thought to be aircrew present, remains of aircrew present.
Right.
In other jurisdictions, they take a different view. America has a specific branch of the American military called JPAC, the Joint Personnel and Missing in Action Accounting Command, which puts out field teams of archaeologists, forensic anthropologists and so on to specifically recover the remains of missing US personnel. They've chosen to do things a different way.
Is that actually the answer, to actually have archaeological units who are tasked with, obviously outside cases of total war, as it were, but when they can, they are tasked with going and investigating and recording such sites in a way which is respectful, which as some people might say, which restores honour to whoever might have died on the site, but also which means that they're logged, that these archaeological sites aren't just seen as it's not possible for them to become almost like sweets scattered across the desert, for example, in the case of the Second World War campaign there. I mean, what do you think, Rhys? Would you be comfortable seeing that? Do you think that is a solution, or would you much rather see a civilian archaeological approach to such sites?
I'd say yes, I do feel comfortable with that. In fact, Australia already has this situation. I do have a friend who is in fact inducted into the RAAF over here as an officer. He's an archaeologist, and the only reason for this was to qualify him to go over with a military unit to Papua New Guinea, where the battle for the Kokoda Track was fought, where we did have planes flying over and crashing there, where there are quite a lot of missing personnel and pilots. So the Papua New Guinea government has basically given the Australian military the okay to go over there and retrieve these personnel when they are found. I think this is a good thing. This is a good thing because it's being looked at by an archaeologist at the head of military division who is trained in being sensitive on such sites. You're also dealing with the same military that the site is related to, so the Australian Air Force. And what I think about, I think there is a further point to this in the sense that the archaeology is educating people within the military on the importance of these sites as well. And I mean, the military's always had a high standard of respecting history, I find, within certain areas. However, there are also issues. There have been issues recently where they had to send anthropologists over to Afghanistan and Iraq in the recent conflict there to basically talk to the militaries that were there about sensitivity training. And I think this works back into our aviation discussion, where you have archaeologists and anthropologists dealing with military to basically not do the right thing, but it's basically making sure that the situation is taken care of in the highest regard.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, I think that is the best way to approach sites.
Okay.
Can I make two points very quickly, Martin, just in following that up? I think it's important to stress that the recovery of the missing, which may be, I think that most people wouldn't argue, is in many respects a social good, something that we as a society might choose to do, isn't archaeology. An archaeological expedition would not set out deliberately to recover the missing.
Yeah.
Although, we can point to many cases where conflict archaeology in particular has been done on sites where the missing have been found and recovered forensically, anthropologically, fully correctly under archaeological conditions, and have even ended up with named headstones because the work's been done so well. So I think it's important to make that distinction, though. And secondly, just in terms of the involvement of the military, certainly in the UK, there's been some very interesting work done recently by the British Defence Infrastructure Organisation, who have an archaeological team led by Richard Osgood currently. And they have been working, for instance, with current serving personnel on an archaeological project called Operation Nightingale, which helps rehabilitate service people who've been injured on active duty, including in Afghanistan. One of the sites they worked on recently was a Spitfire that crashed on Salisbury Plain, and that was a full archaeological excavation. It's just been published in British Archaeology, and I think shows one way forward, and also again the involvement of the current military in this subject area in the way that Rhys has just described in terms of Australia. I think that's, there's some very interesting developments going on, which is again, to come back to where I started, it's one of the reasons I think this is such an interesting and rapidly developing field, and one I'm very happy to be working in. Okay,
so this video is getting quite long, and I suspect we may have to return to these issues at a later date. But I'm going to invite you both to make a brief summarising comment towards the end. But I suppose my submission at the end of this video would be that this is a fascinating situation, in so much as what we have essentially are archaeological sites which are movable, and it's not often that it's not really until you get to a certain point in time that you have an event which can be seen physically, that is to say archaeologically, happening elsewhere, which involves people from a particular country. Now, of course, you do have instances where maybe someone has migrated into a country and has died in the area and has been buried there. But to have such a quick flashpoint event where a national from one country can be found, or a plane from one country can be found in another country, I think it has to present challenges which need to be addressed. It's kind of like having Stonehenge on wings, and it can fly and land somewhere else. And how do you deal with that? Do we try and reclaim Stonehenge if it's flown away, or do we leave it where it is because it's now an archaeological moment and a monument in another country? So for me, that's one of the most interesting things about this discussion. So can I invite you, Andy, to make your final comment?
Yeah. All I would say to finish is there is a very interesting document that was published by the American National Park Service talking about the archaeology of aviation, and one of the comments it makes in there is it isn't just aeroplanes. I think we must remember that we're not just talking about aeroplanes and aircrew, we're talking about a much wider archaeology of aviation. In terms of the archaeology of aviation, I think as archaeologists and professional archaeologists and heritage people, we need to recognise that, as with maritime archaeology and as with industrial archaeology, a lot of the running in terms of recognising the importance of this came from the community. It came from non-specialist, non-academic groups who valued this before ever the professional and academic world of archaeology got interested in this. We're playing catch-up, and we need to respect that, at the same time as perhaps moving things on to a more developed kind of practice in terms of recovery, conservation in situ and publication. And the final comment I'd make is that I hope, and I think we're moving towards the day when an aircraft site specifically is seen in the same way that people have seen shipwrecks, and that is as a sealed time capsule of a moment that freezes the entire experience of that particular object, the aeroplane, and everybody who was on it and had worked on it and so on. So it's about aeroplanes. It's fascinating, but it's not just about aeroplanes.
Okay, and Rhys?
I honestly do believe that with the way archaeology is going in general, archaeology of aviation is going to be just one subject of many that we're going to be talking about in the future as to what actually constitutes archaeology. Where are we going to be overlapping with different professions where we haven't overlapped before? But yeah, I mean, as Andy said, it isn't just aircraft. It's airports, airstrips that have been abandoned. Even NASA, old NASA rocket launch sites and Soviet Union missile sites and things like that. These are all things that people haven't considered archaeology yet, but in the next 50 years, it'll be something that we'll probably be excavating or writing a new history of.
We already are in some cases.
Well, on that note, I think that's quite a good place to end. I think we probably will revisit this topic and expand on this, but it'd just be lovely to see what people watching this video make of it, and if they want to comment below, please do, and we will definitely read your comments, and we'd just love to, I suppose, to continue this conversation, because it's one which is happening at the moment in the archaeological world and in the aviation enthusiasts world, and it's one which I think it's important that archaeologists start to have a voice and an opinion on. So yeah, I look forward to seeing where that goes. Well, as always, guys, thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. See you.
Bye bye. Oh no, the camera moved. Just stay still, you bastard. Right, okay, we're good. It's all good. It's all gonna work. It's fine.